Test. Sound good? Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the University Place Public Safety Forum. I'm Greg Premo, your Chief of Police here. It's now 6 o'clock sharp, so we're going to get started because as all of you are here with us in person, we have some people online that are watching too, so I want to welcome you all and those that are online watching. I also want to introduce Jennifer Hales over in the corner. She's our Public Safety Administrator for the city. And for those that are not here, there should be on the screen, you can see an email address in which you can send your questions to. And Jennifer will be asking those questions throughout the presentation as those come in. So just remember, they're for questions for University Place Public Safety, not comments or anything. Feel free, if you have comments about the presentation or information, feel free to shoot those to us afterwards. But we're going to try and focus on trying to address everybody's questions as they come in for tonight. So back in February of 2020 was the last time we did an in-person public safety forum. If some of you might have been there, that we held that downstairs in the gallery. We had about 55-ish citizens that were in attendance. It was a nice turnout. And then that was the last time we were all able to get together in person. But over the course of the last year and a half, the agency, UPPD here, we've had one virtual forum. We've held a couple different community academies virtually. So we've tried to maintain that communication and connection with the community during this time. But I am happy to be back and doing it in person. I think there's a lot of value in being able to kind of have that connection. So tonight, the goal is to kind of cover these three sections here, talking about what UPPD is all about, the staffing, the services and programs that we provide. We'll talk a little bit about crime statistics here in UP, and then talking about the legislative impacts. I'm sure there's some questions. Everybody's been watching the news and are aware of some of the stuff that's been said out there, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then don't hesitate to ask questions as we're going. You don't need to wait for a pause or anything. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand. Jennifer has a microphone that she'll bring over. If I have to use one, all of you have to use one, type of thing, right? And these are our goals. It's to share some information, so hopefully it's an educational piece there, but also it's an opportunity for you to share either ideas, ask questions. This is just an opportunity to kind of connect and talk about public safety here in our city. And I always try to talk about focusing on UP. Sometimes the questions or ideas kind of start to expand across the United States and other just issues that we're facing as a society. But again, we have limited time, so let's try and focus on University Place specific stuff that we can talk about. So I'm going to start right away with talking about our staffing. You can see this is the organizational structure of UPPD. We have a total of 17 in our office. 16 of us are commissioned officers. And you can see that I report to both the sheriff and the city manager here in the University Place. I'll talk a little bit more about the contract component here, but understanding that this is what you have working dedicated to the city. 12 patrol officers, which are divided up into your 3 shifts. You have 4 on days, 4 on swings, and 4 on graveyard. And those 12 try to cover all 24/7, 7 days a week. We operate with 2 officers on duty at a time. With that staffing level, that's all we can do. So we run with two out on the streets. We have 1 investigator whose primary function is to handle property crime investigations. He will handle a little bit of violent crime investigations, but primarily it's property crimes. Then 1 community resource officer. So this is a uniformed deputy as well. He handles a lot of I would say a little bit more of administrative things, as well as, for example, sex offender checks, our paper services, so protection orders and those types of things. He's handling all of those items. And then he's kind of does special tasks. If we're maybe seeing some issues in a particular area, he's kind of diving into those reports, cases, and looking to see how we might be able to address those as a department if we're seeing a spike in a certain area. So again, so 17 total, kind of shift back to 2009. I was actually one of your sergeants back in 2009 here when there was a budget issue that popped up and the city had to make a major cut to the police department. As you can see, back in 2009, we had 2 sergeants. I was one of them. And lucky, I was the one that got to stay. The other one was removed, and so we went down to 1 sergeant at that time. We had 15 patrol officers and had to cut those down to 12. So throughout like I said, it was down to 15 at that point, so we've made a little bit of progress in adding a couple bodies since then. But to restore our staffing back to where it was, we have a little ways to go. So some people are like, okay, what's that number mean to us? So I try to give you some comparisons, and it's not, I don't think it's fair to say it's not apples to apples, right? Every jurisdiction is made up with different things in terms of activity around public safety. For example, you can see, like the city of Fife is always one that kind of pops out. They have a very low population, but Fife has a very high, what we call transient population, because there's a lot of workers. It's industrial. There's a lot of people that are there actively throughout the day. And then, so they have a need for a higher number of officers per 1,000. So that's why I say is you can see where we sit. But, like I said, it's not apples to apples necessarily. But, the state of Washington ranks, 51st in the nation for the number of officers per citizen. I know there's 50 states. I actually passed the history class, but it's including Washington, D.C. as well. So as a state, we have one of the lowest ratio, or the lowest ratio. And unfortunately, in the city of University Place, we have the lowest of all the cities within the state. So we have some room to bring that number, in my opinion, back up. But I think you'll see in some of the future slides, we're doing a really good job as a community to maintaining a very safe and I think welcoming community with the staffing numbers that we've been working with. So University Place PD, I briefly talked on it earlier. So this is a contract agency, and what that means is the city contracts with the sheriff's department to have sheriff's personnel work here as your police department. So everybody that is working here or assigned here full-time, they were selected amongst the sheriff's deputies to be University Place police officers. So we're somewhat of a detachment, but we were selected and they work here full-time. What that offers to the city is being a smaller agency in and of itself, but having access to the larger resources of the Sheriff's Department. So the Sheriff's Department covers over 400,000 residents in unincorporated Pierce County. And so as you can imagine, they have a much wider service ability with the number of officers that they have. So we don't have traffic officers in University Place, but we do have access to major collision traffic investigators from the Sheriff's Department when we have a major collision. They will come in and handle that investigation for us. Again, other services such as SWAT, K9, search and rescue, that's what SAR is for. And then your major investigations. So if we had a homicide, a major aggravated assault, shootings, those types of things, the Criminal Investigations Division of the Sheriff's Department then comes out and handles those investigations for us. I talked also about this. You know, UPPD was founded on the ideals and the philosophy of community policing. And like I mentioned earlier, even during this pandemic, I think we really tried to maintain that philosophy with our communication and outreach by conducting those 2 community academies, citizen academies that we did virtually. Like I said, we did 1 public forum. What else did we do? We've typically run public safety classes that are free to the community. Those we did have to put on hold because those were really more of a in-person type of thing, but we're hoping to get back to that here in the next 6 months or so as we see the numbers kind of go up and down. And community communication. And it's not just a police department thing. I think as a city government, they're very open to communication. In terms of you can email me directly, you can call me directly. I respond to a lot of citizens who have questions about things that are going on. I much prefer that you get your information from the police department and not from Facebook or next door neighbor or whatever those social media things are. You see something that raises a question about what's happening in your community, go to the source and try and get that accurate information. Shoot me an email. Like I said, you can call me. Hey, I'm hearing what's going on. I've been your chief for just over 2.5 years. And was one of my experiences early on was we're having a rash of these, this type of crime. And then I was like, there was one, but the story kept getting passed along. And so by the time it got here, they were hearing it from different sources, and so it kind of got morphed into there was multiples when in fact there was one robbery that was like that. So again, I just encourage you to just reach out if you ever have questions about something that's going on. A police response that happened in your community and you're not really sure, why the police did it that way, don't hesitate to ask those questions. I know I'm talking fast, but I want to make sure I get the material in and open time, for questions, but you feel free to stop me if something comes up. So let's talk statistics. I like statistics personally, so this is one of my things. What I can tell you is we're doing really good this year in terms of incidents, so crimes in University Place. That is not fitting the narrative of a lot of other jurisdictions not just across the country, but even within Western Washington or even close to us here. Last year, you could see 2019, we really kind of went up high, and this is violent crime incidents, so this is your aggravated assaults, your murders, your sexual assaults, those types of things. So you can see we kind of were, from 2016, we were really kind of trending up. 2020 went down a little bit, and this year we're on pace to be right back around that 2016 number. So this is only through January through June. I'm sorry, it's through June for 2021, but those are the full year numbers for those other years. But so we're back on pace to be back right around that 2016 number, which is a good sign for us. Like I said, in comparison to what other jurisdictions have been facing, they've seen real spikes in violent crimes with shootings and homicides and everything. A common question I do get is, well, why is that, right? And my first answer is, well, if I had a really good, positive answer, I'd probably be, a millionaire with the idea of how to prevent every crime, right? But I can speculate in some reasons, in some ways, about why we're seeing this. I think that when we've looked at some of the numbers of our incidents, and we see when we have had suspects identified, they have not been university-placed residents. They're people that have come from outside. They've come here to commit crimes for whatever reason. I feel like those people are not coming here to do it. They're doing it for wherever they're at. They're not seeing a need to get out of whatever their environment is. That's purely speculation on my part. I can't tell you much beyond other than I'm enjoying where we're at, and I hope it continues, and we're doing what we can to address that as much. It's kind of, in a way, with the COVID impacts on the jail, the COVID impacts on the courts, this is really good news for us that we're in this place, and I hope it continues. But I also can't be completely naive. There's an ebb and flow to criminal activity, just like there is in everything else, the economy or whatever it might be. So, so that's violent crimes. Property crimes. Again, this is the number one thing that faces university places, property crimes, whether it's thefts, vehicle prowls, vehicle thefts, those types of things. But again, we're trending very well. Or we're probably going to end up close to that 2016 number, not nearly as low as the 2019 number, but it'll be probably in between, because we've started to kind of trend back up. So this is numbers through June. So I just gave you the first half of the year. But we're still doing a lot better. Again, I think if you asked people, they would feel like they hear about it. They heard a neighbor had their car broken into, and it's that it must be, crime is on the rise and all over. For us, we're doing pretty good still, even in the property crimes area, which is where we have the majority of our incidents. So this area is talking about police services. So what I have here is dispatched calls, as well as self-initiated calls. And our calls are this number here. I just looked today to try and give we're trending a little bit back on par with where we were last year, but we're still down about 15% in dispatched calls. So which kind of coincides with what we're seeing on the actual reported crimes. Is crimes are down, calls for service are actually down as well. The self-initiated calls are going to be things like traffic stops by officers, officers making contact on their own with suspicious activity, those types of things. It's anything that they self-initiate. And then the dispatched are things that are calls that are initiated by citizens into the non-emergency or 911, either or. So we are seeing a little bit of a drop this year, which has been nice. It does help. As we talked about those staffing numbers, seeing the calls for service, the demand on our officers go down a little bit, I think is a welcomed kind of rest for them in a way, as they handle far more calls per officer than you'll see in our neighboring jurisdictions. So again, I throw out comparisons because again, you see okay, that's what we have in UP, but what does that look like elsewhere? And I also caution that numbers don't necessarily mean exactly how safe a community is, but I think it's fair to look at them to kind of gauge what that means. So the chart on the bottom is your offense rate per 1,000 residents. Kind of very similar to a crime rate, but this is a rate that's generated from, so every year all agencies submit their offenses that occurred there to WASPIC, which is the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. And there's a report that's put out called Crime in Washington. So I just took the total number of offenses that were reported in each of those jurisdictions, and then you're able to look at how that rate is per 1,000 residents. And you can see where we kind of line up in comparison to some of these other jurisdictions of Bonnie Lake, DuPont, those were very similar, even though we're operating with a much lower officer to citizen ratio. Those higher ones, Fife, Lakewood, Puyallup, you're seeing a higher number of offenses per 1,000. And I attribute that to they're a lot more business oriented. Businesses do attract a lot of demands on public safety, calls for service from police. So you have Lakewood and Puyallup, both have malls, very high commercial areas, and in addition with Fife as well, has a lot of their industrial park and that type of activity. So and then the chart on the top is just taking some of those individual cities and breaking it down and giving you offenses per officer. It just is, to me, it's just illustrating the amount of work that our officers are doing in comparison. So they're handling more offenses per officer than our comparables in the county. Okay, no questions so far? Okay, yes, sir. Do you want a microphone? Okay, sorry.
That way everybody can hear you. Hi, Dan. Good to see you.
I was wondering, theft from post office box, mail theft from residences, is that something your office deals with, or is that the Postmaster General who only does those investigations and reports?
So, yes and no. If you call into 911 to make a report on a theft of mail, it will go through us, and those numbers are included in here. Investigation-wise, it kind of depends. We will handle it typically when we find somebody with stolen mail. We won't investigate like where your mail might have ended up unless there was, let's say somebody opened up a credit card in your name, so now we have a fraud associated with stealing your mail or something. That would be something we would investigate. But if something's happened, your mail isn't showing up on a regular basis, that's usually a post office will handle that because there is a chance that it's happening at the post office as well. So, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
You said if there's any question, we can email you or your phone. I don't have any information.
Okay.
Okay. So
Yeah.
if you can provide that for us, I will appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you.
You can, so my information's on our website, of course. The City of UP, go to the police department side, it's on there. You can also, for those that are watching, I know it's not here on the screen, but the UP Public Safety email address also goes to myself and to Jennifer, so we both get it at the same time. So you can always email that one as well, but I can give it to you here when we're done too. I can just give you something directly. Yeah. What's that?
Any business cards?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can get that after we're done. Okay, any other questions? Jumping into the meat and potatoes here. Okay, so legislative impacts. So this last May 2021, several bills were signed by the governor related to police reform. And I say it's about administration, authority, as well as investigations. I think there was, well, There was that many of them that were directly related. I'm going to talk about the two that are highlighted, and the reason is I think those are the two that really impact public safety, the community out there on the streets, and understanding how it impacts police and law enforcement response. These others certainly have a role and have a play in all of this thing, but I just wanted to focus on these two as I think they directly impact you a little bit more. As we talk about these laws, I wanted to give a little bit of context on police authority, because it does tie into these things. And so I want people to at least try to understand what is police's authority around stopping and detaining people. So the first level of a police contact, it's called a social contact, right? So law enforcement can go up and talk to anybody, just like any citizen can go up to another neighbor and say, "Hi, how is your day?" Right? That citizen, when an officer comes up and says, "Hi, how are you doing today?" they have every right to just ignore that officer and turn around and walk away. They're not suspected of criminal activity. The officer has no reason to detain them. They're welcome to engage the officer in a conversation. They're also welcome to just turn around and walk away. So there's always been that kind of level of a contact and authority. It's not really even an authority. It's just an officer trying to engage somebody in a conversation. The next level is that reasonable suspicion. You've probably heard this a little bit if you've been paying attention to the news, the Terry stop detention. So that's all based on the Terry v. Ohio, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case. And that basically is allowing the officer the authority to detain somebody that they suspect, they have reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot. That's what it says in the case. So crime is afoot, which means crime is just happened, is happening, is, has, or will be, is about to happen. So that allows that officer to detain the person, to investigate further what is going on. And they can use force to affect that detention. So if a person is uncooperative, doesn't want to stop, the officer can physically use force to detain that person. Now, the force always has to be reasonable under the circumstances. So that's always been in play. The next level is probable cause. So at reasonable suspicion, I can detain somebody, but I can't arrest them. I'm not able to take them to jail on what I think is what's happening. I have to have more evidence, which then rises to probable cause. And then probable cause then gives me the authority to take that person to jail on whatever crime. Probable cause is, again, it's facts and circumstances that lead a reasonable person to believe a particular person is committing a particular crime, and all the elements of that crime are satisfied. So it's kind of like you have your social contact, which is there's not really any evidence at all. Then reasonable suspicion. Okay, there's an evidence that something's going on here. I have enough that I can detain somebody and investigate further. And then there's probable cause that says I've got enough evidence to actually take this person into custody and take him to jail and have a prosecutor and a court review the entire case. So the first one is House Bill 1310, and that's the use of force. Physical force can only be used when there is probable cause to make an arrest, effect an arrest, prevent an escape, or protect against imminent threat. It also has these additional mandates around de-escalation tactics prior to using force, and they coined the term duty of reasonable care within there. Those asterisks that you see on there, creating physical distance, repositioning, using time and cover, those are things that we've always done. Those have been a part of our use of force policy for years. That is a part of law enforcement in general. That's a part of how we try to deal with people. I will say that the crisis intervention, mental health professional support, those things, when I started 28 years ago, that really wasn't, nobody even thought about it. As much as those of us officers that were out there dealing with it going, I'm not a mental health professional. I really think we need somebody out here. Really in the last, 5 to 10 years, that's really kind of come up. And so now it's a little bit more prevalent that those resources are being ingrained into the responses around mental health. So we have a co-responder program in Pierce County. What these are mental health professionals out in the field that the officers and the deputies can call upon when they're going to a call that involves what's suspected as somebody with some mental health issues or in crisis. It still requires a police response. Although these mental health professionals, they wear a vest similar to the officers, but they're not trained in physical defense to the level of an officer. So the officers are there to make sure that the scene is safe for them to conduct their work too. So we're not in a position to just say, hey, we have somebody in a mental health crisis. Let's just send this, mental health professional on their own to try and make an assessment on that. It's kind of a partnership with the officers kind of being the support to make sure that the scene is safe. The last bullet point there is a part of that duty of reasonable care is must consider leaving the area if there's no threat of imminent harm and no crime in progress, and it hadn't just occurred or is about to occur. Just remember that's a new kind of bullet point around the House Bill 1310. So what did this do in terms of our response? So remember when I talked about reasonable suspicion and I can detain somebody, it eliminated that component. It said you have social contact, hey, how's it going? And now we jump all the way to I have to have probable cause to actually stop that person and investigate further. There is the middle part, the reasonable suspicion is now gone. And we'll talk over a couple scenarios here so it can maybe help give you a better picture on it. So remember it said physical force. The law does not define what physical force is, which is where you hear in the news that law enforcement are saying, hey, we need some interpretation on some of this stuff. We don't know what it is. So the Criminal Justice Training Commission that runs the police academy for all officers in the state of Washington, they provided their definition to help. And this is what they say: any technique or tactic reasonably likely to cause transient pain and or injury. When we talk about physical force, I think a lot of people see police, they think force, they think it is the knockdown, drag down fights, there's all kinds of kicking, punching, weapons involved, when in fact physical force can be simply just grabbing somebody by the arm and trying to escort them out of an area, maybe out of a bar where there being a problem, or it could be anything. The detention where we go back to asking somebody to stop on reasonable suspicion and grabbing them by the arm, and then they start to resist, and can I just pull them to the ground with a simple arm bar, put them on the ground and do handcuffs? That prevents that from being able to do that under the new law. So here's our first scenario. So the caller to 911 says they can hear a male and female fighting next door. The female is yelling for help, and then things go quiet. The male is then seen running out the front door down the street. A description is provided. The officer arrives in the area and sees the male subject as described. Can the officer contact the individual? The answer is yes. What if the subject runs? Can the officer give chase? The answer is no. We do not have probable cause for that person. We have reasonable suspicion. So that's the difference. The reasonable suspicion, there's enough there to say this person was probably involved in a fight, which is probably an assault, maybe even domestic violence related. We're going to stop that person to investigate further, to give us some time to go contact the potential victim or the other half and determine what's going on. Under the new one, the new laws, we're not in a position to do that. So it does make some challenges around responding to those specifically domestic violence calls where you have one half that has now fled the scene. Mental health welfare checks. This is kind of, again, another one of the ones that are a topic that's coming up around this response. So the imminent threat piece, if you remember, you had to have probable cause for the crime, and then there was a comment in there about you then had to have imminent threat of injury to themselves or others. Imminent threat, though, does require the person has to have the apparent ability, opportunity, and intent to immediately cause death or serious injury. So that becomes a little bit of the challenge around dealing with people in a mental health crisis. So the scenario we have here is it's a September afternoon, and a person in the park is running around yelling things and making odd comments. They are partially clothed, so clearly having a mental health episode. Can the police respond? Yes. There's nothing in the laws that says the police cannot respond to any particular type of call. Can they detain the individual for mental health evaluation or transport to the hospital? The answer is no. They are not necessarily an imminent threat to themselves or others. They may be very clear to most of us that there's some sort of mental health issue going on. Yes, we would probably have a co-responder maybe come with us and try to initiate contact, have a conversation as best you can with that individual to see if they will voluntarily go to a hospital. But there's nothing that permits us to physically detain that person, to get them in an ambulance to then get to the hospital. Now, if this scenario was different, and let's say it's December, and it's 2 in the morning, it's 28 degrees outside, and this person is running around in a pair of shorts. Now you could probably articulate that person is in an imminent threat to themselves because they're probably going to go into hypothermia in a matter of an hour or so. Now you could probably say, yeah, I can use force as an officer to detain that person, get them into an ambulance, and get them to the hospital for that medical and mental health evaluation. So again, we're back to there's nothing in the law that says we can't go, but you have to just evaluate the circumstances because the rules have changed a little bit. So, and again, this duty of reasonable care component comes into play as well. If you recall, it said that if there is no crime and there is no imminent threat, the officers now need to consider just leaving the area. So that's presented some challenges for officers to try and decide, do I even make contact at first? Consider that person that appears to be having a mental health episode, an officer in a uniform comes up, is that going to escalate things, potentially? Is it going to make them become violent now and all of a sudden the officer's in a position where he's having to defend himself? With this in there, the question is, well, why did the officer even go up and make contact if there was no sign of imminent threat from the very beginning? So I'm not saying one thing or another. It's just those are factors that our officers are now having to consider, because they come back on the officer and say, well, you violated the duty of reasonable care component by even making contact with them in the first place. Go ahead, there's a question.
So my question would be, if I am an employee at a place, like I'm in the management field, and I'm contacting because we have somebody in our building who is not fully dressed, who is showing signs of illness, such as maybe coughing, not wearing a mask, these things. Are these things that we would want to present saying like, hey, our customers are worried, they're in an environment where it's not safe due to COVID, these symptoms. Now, are you now able to state that this person is not well, not following, we're not allowed to have them come into our building? Like, how do we handle something in that perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is kind of a challenge that we're running into with that scenario that you talked about, whether maybe it's just the simple trespassing individual on private property, and maybe a panhandler or the loiterer person that's sleeping on the sidewalk or those types of things. What we're being faced with is, again, the officers having to evaluate everything they're given. What you're going to see as a citizen is maybe some more questions. You might get questioned a little bit, exactly what are they doing? Can you tell me? Have you engaged them in any way? If you're the property owner or manager, have you asked them to leave? If they're not a resident or a tenant or anything like that, and you've asked them to leave and they're refusing, now they're trespassing. So now we have a criminal element that does help the officer have, okay, I have an actual crime that I can go address. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the officer is going to take them to jail, but it does give them the authority to then go and engage that individual. So I know that we have some property owners, business managers, business owners, that in the past would just see somebody and say, hey, I'm not comfortable contacting this individual, I'm just going to call the police. And we would come out and kind of be their agent for them. We're having to kind of step back from that now and say, you might get a call from the officer saying, have you gone out and talked to that person at all on your own? Has anybody done that for you? Because when they then refuse to cooperate with you as the property owner, now we have something that we can help enforce, your rights as a property owner. Doing it without that, there's no crime, there's no imminent threat. The officers are going to have to say, well, we're not going to go based on the duty of reasonable care. We're probably not even going to go make contact. Our training that we've given our officers around these is, well, one, it's slow down a little bit, really evaluate things, but you can also go and observe. So you might make this phone call into 911 or the non-emergency, whatever it is, about some activity, and you might see the patrol car come pulling up, stop, sit there for a few minutes, and then drive away because he hasn't seen a crime now being committed, and he doesn't see an imminent threat to anybody, and does not want to put themselves in a position where somebody can now hold them liable for the changes in the law. The liability has gone up on officers. They want to hold the officer as an individual accountable for their actions. There's new decertification laws. So there's a lot of things that they have to consider. And it's just good that people are aware of the changes in the law. It was a good question. She'll come up. Jennifer will get you.
Have you noticed, or are you guys tracking an increase or decrease in resolutions to calls before the passage of the bill and after the passage of the bill? And are you guys considering working with the council to draft a letter like Lake Stevens did to have an emergency convening of the legislature to further clarify this law?
Yeah, so she had multiple questions in there, so that's right. So talking about dispositions, what we did implement right away was the officers, let's say they get the call, the scenario that we were just had, they've changed in our computer system, they have to type in what their actions were and why. So let's say the officer says, I'm not going to respond to that call. They are required now to type in there is no sign of probable cause, no crime is being committed, they don't appear to be an imminent threat, I am not responding to the scene, per House Bill 1310. So we're monitoring it a little bit that way as far as seeing like the effects of, we're not really doing anything beyond kind of trying to keep data in terms of how we've responded in relation to that. And then talking about special legislation I think that was your other question, was whether or not we've requested those. I know that those have been requested at a much higher level. So the state, the WASPIC, which is the Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, they've requested it from day one that we need to get some clarification on these things. Specifically House Bill 1310, if you look in there, it says the Attorney General will give their interpretation on a model policy, but they have till next summer to do it. So they passed it and then said we need to try and figure it out on our own until next summer. They've asked for the Attorney General to speed that up a little bit. The only thing that I've seen out of the Attorney General's office was a response that said, nothing in the bill says the police can't go. If they're saying they can't go because of it, they're wrong. And I agree with that. Nothing in the bills say you can't go to anything. The police can go, and that's what I stress to all our citizens is it's also not your job to try and decipher and interpret this. You call 911 when you think police are needed. It's our job to try and navigate the changes. Again, back to your question about the legislative special session, I know it's been asked and it's been pretty much told they are not going to do it. they don't want to go back into session for this. They said they'll try and, that's what I'm getting from the associations when I sit in on those meetings, that they will address it in the next session. To whatever degree they do address it, I guess we'll have to find out. So it's a good question, though, I think.
Does the mental health episode or mental health crisis include someone who's high on drugs?
Yes. In terms of bringing the COVID, I guess, do you mean whether they're an imminent threat to themselves or not, or our response? Okay. Yeah, it's kind of tough. So, I mean, I think a lot of times mental health episodes can be associated with drug abuse. And there's usually a kind of there's an element in there of that. It doesn't necessarily change our response. The drug law changed, which I wasn't covering necessarily tonight, but the state did change possession of illegal narcotics. So we do not typically respond to complaints of drug use. The law changed now that says, so I'll do this. So hard drugs, your heroin, your methamphetamines, cocaine, the hard drugs used to be illegal in the state of Washington, right? You could not possess it. Then there was a decision by the state Supreme Court in early 2021 that threw that law out and said it was unconstitutional. That there was an element in it did not say you knowingly possessed it. And so therefore, the state Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional. So we went without an actual drug law until July. Any drug was legal. This fix that the legislature did was they changed the law from a felony to a misdemeanor, and then required that there's 2 referrals to drug treatment before police can physically arrest and take somebody to jail. Does that make sense? Are we following that? So if an officer, let's say we get a shoplifter in custody, and got them in handcuffs, and we're doing the thing, we do a search of their person, and we find heroin on them. You can't charge them with the heroin unless you can verify that they've been given referrals to drug treatment twice before. I don't think anybody has a problem with referrals for drug treatment. I think we all would love to see people who are abusing drugs and have an addiction that they're getting help. The challenge that we have is there's no system in place to track those referrals. Now, we can do it internally as an agency around our reports, in which we immediately changed our report writing system so that we can, when the officers do identify somebody, they give them a referral information, they're writing a report that identifies it. So the next time an officer comes across Greg Premo and he's got heroin, they can look in the system and go, hey, a month ago, Officer so-and-so stopped you and he gave you the referral. That was number 1, here's number 2, and then they write that up. And so number 3, now they can be taken into custody and charged with the unlawful possession. So there's a lot of issues around that. The felony, so previously it was a felony level crime, which is a whole nother court. So that's Superior Court that handles felony level crimes. Superior Court operated a drug court, so people that were brought in on drug charges, a lot of those first or second, even maybe third offenders were being diverted to drug court and running through those programs. Most municipalities, certainly your smaller cities, who handle misdemeanor level crimes do not have a drug court. They don't have those resources as a part of their municipal court. We contract with Pierce County District Court for our municipal court, so we do have access to that here at University Place. So that is a positive. The challenge is all the costs associated with all of that now went to the city versus before the state would handle it because it was a felony level crime. So those are some of the challenges. So back to how we deal with people that are on drugs or suspected of maybe somebody is out. You can see them using drugs in a parking lot. It's a misdemeanor crime that we don't even know if it's really a crime unless we contact them, verify that they've had 2 referrals prior. So we don't even respond to those calls unless there's some other element in there to justify the contact. Again, back to I need probable cause if things go sideways and somebody doesn't want to cooperate with the officer and there is a use of force. So it's gotten trickier in that respect too. Yeah.
So you mentioned that in UP you're keeping track of how many times somebody gets referred, but if somebody's caught with heroin in Fife and then somebody gets caught with something and that person goes to Lakewood and gets caught and then they come to UP, is UP going to be able to know that they've already had 2?
So fortunately for us, everybody that's on our report writing system, which incorporates most of your agencies in Pierce County, will have access to that information. Outside of the county or State Patrol does one, we won't know. It's only our report writing system. So yeah, it helps in terms of we'll be able to check Lakewood and Furcrest and Tacoma and those things. We're all on the same report writing system, so that works. But it's not at a state level for sure where, like I can run somebody's driver's license and see if it's a valid across the state. It doesn't matter where because the state houses that database for that information. So, okay. Okay, House Bill 1054. It's called the Police Tactics Bill. I pulled out, there's several components to it, around use of military-grade equipment, tear gas, there's a lot of things in it which I don't think it really addresses things on a very kind of public safety as a community element. I think those were very specific kind of components to it. But I did talk about the vehicle pursuits component because I do believe that is a direct correlation to public safety. So the new law says there must be probable cause, there's that word again, to believe that a person in the vehicle has committed or is committing a violent offense or sex offense or an escape. And they define what escape is. Escape is not just trying to get away. They actually define it's a part of the RCW. It's like escape from a correctional facility, escape from custody in a van, that type, like if somebody's already been arrested and is in a correctional situation. Or there's reasonable suspicion a person in the vehicle has committed or is committing a DUI offense. And pursuit is necessary for identifying and apprehending the person, and the person poses an imminent threat to the safety of others, and the safety risk of failing to apprehend outweigh the pursuit, is basically what it's saying. So here, I'll jump into the scenario. So scenario here, drive-by shooting just occurs. Witnesses see the vehicle and provide 911 with a description of the car as it flees the area. The suspect vehicle is described as a newer orange Dodge Challenger. No description of the occupants. As the officer arrives in the area, they spot a car matching that description about a mile from the scene. Can the officer attempt the stop of the car? Yes. What if the car takes off? Can they pursue? No. There is no probable cause at this point for an occupant. There is reasonable suspicion that the car and the occupants were involved in a violent crime, but probable cause has not been established at this point. Remember, probable cause requires a particular person has committed a particular crime, and there's elements and evidence to support the arrest of that individual. We don't even know who's driving the car. There's certainly enough information to justify stopping that car, and if it takes off, to pursue it, because you could say there's reasonable suspicion that it's involved in that violent crime of a drive-by shooting. Some people will say, there is an element in there to say, okay, well, what if the officer is right around the corner, bam, 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 they hear the shots, and the car goes speeding right by them? Well, now we're really close to the scene. That car, and you could probably articulate maybe now that it's closer to probable cause because they're right there, really close to the scene. versus being a mile away. It's been a little bit of a time lapse. Although the car is somewhat unique as an orange Dodge Challenger, we're not really sure that it gets up to that probable cause level. I think most of us in law enforcement would say it's still at the reasonable suspicion level, and we would not pursue, even though they were just involved in a violent crime. So this scenario actually happened probably 2 months ago now, where the drive-bys were in Tacoma, and the witnesses had a description of the vehicle, but of course they don't have a description of the people inside. You can see muzzle flashes coming out. You can do a description of the vehicle. The last one occurred fairly close to Lakewood Drive, which borders University Place, and one of our officers was down there. They then, about 20 minutes later, this car, unique-looking car, just goes screaming by at a very high rate. In that scenario, we're not saying that there's not probable cause to arrest somebody. Even though they've committed there's reasonable suspicion that they've committed 3 drive-by shootings. Because the probable cause, again, goes to a particular person. So there's just challenges around that component. In the past, another scenario that I like to give is just simply the bank robbery, right? You're the citizen walking in, and out comes this guy running out of there, jumps into a truck and takes off, and then all of a sudden the bank robber comes in, you come in, the teller's like, oh, we were just robbed, and you're like, oh, well, he jumped into a white truck and he just headed that way. You give that information to the officers, depending on where they spot the car, but typically that is not going to be enough to justify a pursuit because we don't have any information on the individual. Now, if they were able to provide a really good description of the suspect that's unique and the officer can articulate that they see that person driving at the time, you might be able to get to that probable cause. But again, it's just the challenges that we now have. In the past, reasonable suspicion was there, and then the pursuit would be permissible under law. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed we'd do it. There's a lot of other factors you have to consider, and we'll talk about that as well. But you weren't violating state law. So the other component is the officer then has to determine, okay, do we do the pursuit? Is it justified? Okay, if he makes the wrong decision and there is a pursuit, what happens if there is a crash? Is he personally liable? And then an element of, is the evidence that's then gathered not admissible because they come back and say, well, you really shouldn't have pursued him from the beginning. So there's a lot of things that they have to consider in that decision. So the second scenario is you arrive home to find a truck in your driveway and a male subject walking out your front door with a TV in hand. The subject jumps in the truck and speeds off. You call 911, provide a description of the truck. An officer arrives in the area and sees the truck. Can the officer attempt to stop the truck? Yes. Can they pursue the truck? No. Again, this is back to not just PC. Residential burglary is not a violent crime, and therefore is not permissible regardless under the new law. So it's whether you had probable cause or not is irrelevant. It's not one of the crimes that are permitted under the new law. So the officer cannot, as soon as he puts the lights on and that vehicle starts to speed up, he needs to shut everything down and let that vehicle go, regardless of any other factors. So I think you probably could articulate that there is probable cause in this scenario. If they provided a description of the person, the proximity to the house, like we were talking about before, I think they could get there. I don't expect you to read this. It's kind of small, but again, it's kind of back to the whole concepts of what people not in law enforcement think about use of force, and they might have this perspective. Vehicle pursuits have always been very heavily regulated, and this is straight from our vehicle pursuit policy. You can see there's a lot of factors that we consider when we make a decision whether or not to pursue a car. It is not the car took off, therefore we chase. That has not been the case for many, many years. The seriousness of the crime is certainly paramount to decide whether or not the apprehension outweighs the risk to the public. We factor in things like the time of day, the amount of traffic, the location, my resources. If I'm an officer that's by myself and I used to work out for the sheriff's department in an outside detachment towards Buckley. I might be out there by myself for, 30, 40 miles away from anybody. Am I going to pursue somebody by myself? Probably not. So those are factors that we were considering a long time ago. So I just wanted to share that it's not, hey, somebody runs, there's a vehicle pursuit, and now the new state law is going to take care of that. There's case law, there has been all kinds of stuff around limiting vehicle pursuits that were already in place. It's just now they've codified it in a state law with those elements there. So, okay. How does this change police services? Again, I talked about this. Nothing says we can't go to any call. That's not in there. What it has changed is our authority when we're there, and so that has changed how we respond to some calls. What we've really stressed is officers taking their time. It might reduce the response time or increase the response time, but we really want them to focus on, do you have the probable cause? Our focus is now on establishing probable cause, because if I come across that individual who's possibly the suspect, I want to make sure that we have that established at that point in case there's no cooperation. Again, it's not your job to try and decipher between these laws as to when I call, there's no probable cause, so I'm not going to call. That's not your job. That's the officers that are working through those things. This is, it's going to place more demand on the police as far as resources. So again, let's take the scenario of, really anything where we have a suspect that has left the scene. We need to get officers to the scene to try and work really hard to establish probable cause. So that's going to be very paramount. Difficult, right, when you have only 2 officers working, because I really don't want the one officer trying to engage with a potential suspect of a crime by himself, while the other one's trying to get to the scene to establish the probable cause. So there's going to be times where that officer's just going to have to make a decision to just let that person go. We'll go to the scene, see what we got, establish it from there, and then try and figure out who that was walking in on the street at another time. Again, that's what we're talking about. So additional police resources is related to investigations. I have one investigator in University Place. I think we're going to see more cases kind of thrown to him. It's like, hey, here's a description of the person we saw, but we couldn't stop them under the new laws, so, do your best to try and figure out who that person was that was walking away. There's some other laws that were passed that I think that were going to impact investigative resources as well. There's one around juveniles. You now, if you want to detain a juvenile for an investigation, you have to they have to talk to an attorney. They can't waive that right like everybody else. They have to be in touch with an attorney before you can talk to them. So even if I'm detaining a kid to investigate something, there's a potential that we're just going to not do that and just wait to have an investigator do the follow-up so they can set up an established contact with an attorney prior in advance. So there's just some challenges around those things. I know there was a lot of pushback from the law enforcement side around that one, because considering the entire state, there has to be attorneys available, which DAC, Department of Assigned Counsel, has said that they will be available for these phone calls 24/7. We'll find out if that's true. I think that's going to be a challenge when they realize how many juveniles are out there at 2 o'clock in the morning and getting stopped by the police for suspected of criminal activity. So it's just going to create some additional challenges. And this is the other thing that I talk about is we will adapt. Again, it's not your job to try and figure this out. I've been in it for 28 years. There's numerous new laws that have come across, case law that has changed the way we do things over the years. We will adapt. We've done it with new tactics, new training. Like I said, co-responders weren't even a thought 28 years ago, and now they're very much integrated, and they're getting more and more, which is a great thing. So I think we'll get there. We're in a, my personal opinion is these new laws are going to impact public safety. I think they have a negative impact. There's probably some positives out of some of these, for sure. But we will adapt and make adjustments as best we can, for sure. Because ultimately, our mission is to serve the community, to serve, protect, and seek justice for everyone. So try and stay focused on that mission and work within the new rules. As I said, they change all the time, regardless, whether we necessarily agree with them or not. Like I mentioned earlier, too, the legislators getting together, or this next session, and so we'll see what comes of that. Maybe I think many people are recognizing there was some unintended consequences from the passage of some of these. So maybe we'll get to a place that everybody can agree is the best path moving forward. Because even if you look at some of the law enforcement organizations, and I speak mainly for my knowledge of WASPIC and what they've put, is everybody is for some reforms and some changes, but we got to make it very kind of thoughtful reform and not too hastily, that we understand how it works. Law enforcement is so complex. It is not a black and white operation. X happens, you do Y. There's so much of a gray area that is in there that it's so difficult to just pass this law and say, look, there you go, that's how you do it now. Well, what about all these scenarios that you didn't consider? So it's just going to be challenging as we go forward. So that's all I had on that. Do we have any other questions? We got one here.
Is there any requirement for use of dash or body cams, and do you use them here?
So the Sheriff's Department is in the process of getting body and dash cams for everybody, to include myself. So I don't know if people want to watch me type emails, I guess, but so we are in the process of getting those. In fact, dash cam installs start October. So I'm hoping that got everybody outfitted by the first of the year. But yeah, we're moving forward. Is there a requirement? There was no specific requirement in the laws. There is a requirement around audio recording of interrogations. I think that was kind of their roundabout way of saying, well, if you want to comply with this law, you better get a body cam, because that can record. It only requires audio recording of an interrogation in the field, but so obviously a body cam would cover that.
What is your guidance or the sheriff's guidance on the military equipment, specifically the 50 cal, and then specifically the 12 gauge and the beanbag?
Yeah. So under that 1054 bill, the police tactics one, it said no more military grade equipment, and it specifically identified 50 caliber weapons or greater are no longer permitted. So technically, I think most people are saying that a shotgun is larger than a 50 cal. So therefore, it is not permissible. And beanbag, if you're not familiar, so a beanbag round is basically a beanbag that shoots out of a shotgun. It uses a shotgun shell, but it shoots a beanbag. It's a less lethal tool, which we have in our department. Some agencies interpreted that 1054 says you can't have it, therefore they pulled all their shotguns, then they pulled their beanbag shotguns as well, because by the letter of the law of 1054, it's considered military grade equipment. Under 1310, it says agencies should use more or less lethal equipment. So there's a little bit of a contradiction, and some agencies went, I don't care, 1054 says pull it, we're pulling it, we don't want to get in trouble. The sheriff has interpreted, or made the decision, I should say, that we're going with sanctity of life is our primary goal, and that less lethal, the 1310 component of less lethal is going to outweigh the military grade issue in 1054, and has continued to authorize the use of beanbags. We don't really carry shotguns anyway, we had beanbags, but also left it up to the individual officers. So it's not mandated that the officer carries it. If I'm uncomfortable, because my interpretation says I'm looking at 1054 and I do not want to be sued or decertified by the state for using it, I have that choice. Does that answer your question? Okay. Because again, back to the use of force component, another one of the laws that I did not cover was the duty to intervene. So that was passed as well. And as I've said throughout the last year when I've had conversations, the duty to intervene has been a part of our policy, and I think most agency policies for years. So the duty to intervene when they see excessive force. This has also brought up that issue, is my agency says that the beanbag shotguns are okay to use. But the officer in another agency, his agency says, that's a violation of 1054. It's a higher than a 50 caliber weapon. And now we're both at the scene together. And I pull out my beanbag because the guy's standing there with a knife and he's threatening people, and we go to use it. Does that officer have a duty to intervene and stop the other officer from using the beanbag? If you go to look at the duty to intervene law, it says he does. He needs to do something. If not, at a minimum, he has to report that as a use of excessive force. And then that goes to the state, who then, by the new law of decertification, says the officer that used the beanbag should be decertified and removed from service. Not saying that definitely would happen, but if you follow along the kind of the dotted, the bouncing ball here on the dots of the new laws, that's what could happen. Again, that's all the things that they have to factor in.
Thank you. This is regarding the body cams. Is it going to be constant recording, or can an officer turn it off when they eat lunch or use the restroom or whatever?
Yeah.
Side note. But second, can a person, say I'm a victim of a violent crime and I'm trying to give my story but I don't want it recorded, can I request that?
So I wish I could answer your question more definitively, because we don't even have the policy out yet. The sheriff is still working through the specifics of the policy. All I know is at this point is it's not on all the time. The officers will have to turn it on at any time they're contacting somebody. And again, don't quote me because the policy isn't finalized, but my understanding is if the victim does not want it to be recorded, they can turn the recording part off of the audio, but they would keep the camera part on in case something happened, type of thing. Now, it may not be on the individual, but the camera would be on. Correct. That's been the challenge for years around body cams in the state of Washington. There's been a few agencies that have had them, but under this state, they're all subject to public disclosure. And I know that for us, to get ready for the addition of the body cams, they hired 3 people, full-time employees, to be able to handle all the requests that come in to want to view the footage. Just random people make those requests, and under our state law, we have to provide that to them. No. I mean, other than a case, so we don't have to, if the case is actively being investigated, it doesn't get released. There will be able to blur faces and stuff like that. That's my understanding. So I guess there is some protection in there. And I think as an agency, they can petition to not release something if there is sensitive information. Like a juvenile who's a victim of a crime, they can petition to not have that released. So, any other questions? My goodness. Got one more?
So what's the one thing that you would like, if your citizens came up and said, what could we do to support you, or what would you like to have us be doing besides watch out for our neighbors or whatever? What would that be?
Well, one thing I think is you need to engage with your local legislators, your representatives and your senator here, and talk to them about what their intentions are moving forward. I think it's important for them to hear from you all. They've heard it from the law enforcement side, of course, but you're their constituents, and I think it's important that you reach out. If you have concern, ask, whether they voted for those or not and why. Maybe they have a different opinion than mine, right? So I think as a voter, I think you might want to ask that question. Why did you support it? Because the chief said this, but I don't take my word, just my word for it. I think it's a fair thing to ask them what's their perspective and why are they supporting that kind of approach to law enforcement in our community. And outside of that, I don't want to give you a sob story, but this has been a rough, year and a half for law enforcement in general. Deserved, undeserved, whatever you want to call it. I've really tried to really share the story that what happens elsewhere across the country is not necessarily what happens here in your own community. I'm really proud of the officers that we have here. I'm proud of the city's response to our community. We do a lot with very little, and it's not just the police department. As I've always said at any type of community talk that I'm doing, is public safety is a team event. It's not just the police, it's the citizens, it's the police department, it's having great parks, it's having a good school system, great roads. I mean, those all contribute to not only an actual safe community, but certainly the feeling of safety. We always try to address criminal activity at the lowest level we can, because we don't want to see it rise, and we do what we can with that. And so some of it is, again, back to your question about what you can do. If you're seeing things or you're having questions, don't hesitate to reach out and ask those questions about what's going on. I think stopping rumors and the wrong message is really important. I don't know if everybody read my Chief's Corner that came out yesterday. I'm just really trying to stress how positive this community is towards its law enforcement. Yeah, I mean, we're not perfect, and not every single person is the most supportive of law enforcement, but in general, our officers are really blessed to be working here. And we have a lot of support that comes into our department. And so I thank you, and also, just appreciate the support that we have gotten, and ask that it continues. Law enforcement in general, and including the Sheriff's Department, are hurting for people. We have retirements. It's not just Seattle that's seeing, the 300 that are leaving. They're down 300 bodies. The Sheriff's Department, which affects University Place, is in the same kind of condition. We have a record number of retirements and people resigning from law enforcement. And so how can you help? Well, do you know somebody that you think would be a good officer? It doesn't matter their male, female, their age, their race, their orientations, or what. I mean, we want the department to reflect its community, and I can tell you in all my years, there's been a wide gamut of people that come in with all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences, and they all make great officers in different ways. So if you know somebody that's thinking about it, try and be a voice of maybe encouragement and not fall into the kind of the narrative that's out there, because our greatest recruiter are their family and friends that kind of encourage them if they had an interest in it. I've met with a few young people that are graduating college that are interested in it. So if you have somebody, I'm happy to sit down and talk with them about what it means to be in law enforcement. I think part of this kind of narrative and movement really is about getting the new kind of young crop coming through. I think that they have a different perspective that is valuable, and we can use more of that. So, yeah, I think we had a question. Oh, over here.
You are mentioning scarce resources in rough year. So what does your department outlook look like after October 18th? Are you worried, or are you pretty confident in your staffing beyond the 18th? And then actually I have an unrelated question after that, if you don't mind.
Okay. Well, we're not impacted by the vaccine mandates at the county level, if that's what I'm assuming you're referring to. Yeah, so I think we're going to be maybe in better position because there's some other agencies that have it, and the officers are declining and leaving those agencies. So I think we're being hopeful that we might have some good lateral candidates that are coming in.
Next question is, with the building of apartments and whatnot, is the council asking your input on increasing your fundage? Because with more population already, you're at a shortfall for coverage. Mm-hmm. Increasing the population even more, are you getting sought for advice or on the population growth here in UP?
Yes, to a certain degree, there's been, I think he's got another one over here too, Jennifer, too. Okay. Oh, okay, yeah. I can't see the facial expressions, right, yeah. And I don't have my glasses on. If you didn't notice, I had to take my glasses off because I was steaming up. So you're all just a giant blur to me, right? Sorry, now I got diverted off of that. So yes, we have had those conversations about the new apartment buildings, and specifically, we looked at what are the calls for service around apartment buildings versus different areas, and how might this impact public safety. And what I did is I looked at particular apartment complexes, pulled 5-year averages for calls for service, and compared it to residential neighborhoods. So some apartment complexes generate more calls for service, but what we found is that's kind of an anomaly. It's certain ones that we have more frequent activity at, but in general, the number of residential units, so you might have an apartment complex that has 130 units, really generates about the same amount of calls for service as a neighborhood of 130 single-family homes. Now, those 130 units, I could have 130 here and 130 here, and so the stretch of the street might generate a little bit more, but if we look at it on a very individual kind of this complex versus this giant neighborhood, they're doing them the same. As far as additional staffing, we certainly have had those conversations. I mean, that's, I'm sure council and the city manager are tired of hearing me. When can we have a conversation about adding bodies to University Place? As I showed you, I was here in 2009 as your sergeant, and I came into this place with, wow, this is great. Look, we got 25 of us, and I had a traffic officer and another sergeant, and then, you know, the housing thing happened, and we had to make some cuts, and now I'm back as the chief, and we've got to do something to try and get to where we're at, and it's kind of hard to sell for some people to say, well, okay, what are we going to do? And I'm not the finance person for the city, but I know that. Well, actually, I put this up here. So I thought somebody might have a question about taxes. I did put it after the thank you because I was like, well, maybe we won't talk about it, but usually it comes up. So, again, I do get this phone call. You know, it's usually something about, I don't see the police very often. You know, what's going on? And where's my property tax? I pay property taxes. I pay a lot. You and I both, okay? I pay property taxes too. But just understand that 7 cents on the dollar of all your property taxes, that's what goes to the city. And the city dedicates all of that to the police department to pay for your department. So it goes all into the public safety fund. You can see that you're not, of your property taxes, not very much goes to your local community, right? It doesn't go to the city. You can see where it's all going in. In fact, I was amazed that the county gets more than the city. but I'm a county employee, so maybe I should be happy about it. I don't know. So I'm conflicted, right? No. So just that's a challenge, right, that we're faced is the limited amount of money that's coming in. And of course, property taxes only increase 1%. Mine didn't go up 1%, but you know what I mean. So it's they can only the assessed values kind of go up, and that impacts us. But still, 7 cents on the dollar go to the city, and we dedicate it all. So you can see, and these two charts are on the city's finance website. If you want to go there to look at it, you can see how much is going to the police department in comparison to some of the other elements within us. And as I said earlier, those other two are vital to a safe community. I'm not showing this as a, hey, let's all be on the same line here. We're completely different entities, but just understanding that what percentage and what amount is actually being spent on policing and law enforcement in comparison to some of those bigger pieces of the pie. So back to the question is, yeah, we're having conversations to try and get input from citizens about what kind of public safety they want to see. Do they think we need more? Don't just take the chief's, answer. You look at the data, look it around. Do you feel that you need to have a different number versus the 0.48 per 1,000 in UP? And should we be more closer to our neighboring jurisdictions? And then how do we pay for that? And do we want to pay for it? Is certainly a conversation to have, and it's up to the citizens. Like I said, we do the best we can with what we got, and we will continue to do that. I think we have another question.
You mentioned a potential increase in bodies to the sheriff's office after the 18th. But if that doesn't happen with the record number of retirements that you also mentioned, is there a potential for us to lose the number of officers that is allotted to UP, since we kind of share resources and we have with larger communities with potentially more crime?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. We're kind of faced a little bit with that right now. So it's a yes and no answer, which forgive me for that. But so right now with the sheriff, so for example, we have an officer that's on military activation for a full year. Typically, the way we would run in the past, the sheriff's department would backfill. They would send us somebody that's been assigned to South Hill Patrol and say, hey, you're going to work in UP for the next year while that person is out on military activation. That's not happening right now. We are having to go down one body because they do not have enough over there to fill their need within the rest of the sheriff's department. So that person's shift is being vacant and going on overtime. The good part it's a minor good part. The city is getting a credit, so they're not having to pay for that officer since we're going down. So it's going to help offset some of those overtime costs, but it's not what we want, right? Ultimately, we want full staffing for what we're paying because it provides the most services we can. But yeah, we're feeling the effects of it right now. I know that I don't think we would go below that. The sheriff understands where we already are in terms of our staffing being pretty low as it is. So if for some reason we had another vacancy, I think that we would fall in that, okay, we got to fill that one. But right now it was, Chief Premo, I need you to go down one. So, yes, sir. So, good question. Back up to Amy.
We want the viewers to be able to hear you also.
So what can we do to get more officers? Do we need to go to city council meetings? What can we do to get more officers?
Yeah, I think it's important to engage with your council. Whether it's a phone call, email, talk with them about how you're feeling and what your desires are as a community. I think whether it's about policing or everything else. I think that's what they need. That's what they're going to do, right? I mean, that's what their job is to try and enact things and pursue things that they feel the community is wanting. ultimately, I think it's going to fall to you all anyways in some sort of a vote. So, yeah, I would encourage you to engage with them as we have somebody here.
Hi, I'm Caroline Belissi. I'm your current mayor of University Place, and I appreciate you guys all coming out today to listen about the challenges that we are facing, both from a policing standpoint and a financing standpoint. I know that it is a #1 priority on council. I have been on council since 2010. We have talked about it every budget cycle. The issue is that property taxes do not cover the cost for an additional office, for any additional officers. Each time we have had extra funding that, due to cutting our budget elsewhere, where we're able to, we have dedicated it to adding police officers. And we don't want to have a budget where this year we have $500,000 in excess funds. Let's hire a police officer that's only going to be able to work for 3 years, and then we're back to square one again. So we look at our budget long term, 10 years down the road. How is this addition going to impact? So since 2010, we have added 2 additional officers based on our input from the police chief. Our goal this next year is to reach out to the community and see what your appetite is for a potential tax increase. We did a levy in early 2011, 12 sometime, and it was voted down by the community 3-1. That cost the city close to $50,000 to hold that election, to only be told by the community that they did not want additional taxes to pay for police officers. So we are gun shy and spending unnecessary funds for something that the community is going to overwhelmingly say no. So if you are interested in it, within this next year, there will be information forums, there will be outreach, we will be conducting surveys of the community. I would ask that you talk with your neighbors, get them interested in understanding the need for this. We don't have extra funding that we can put into it. You see all the road projects and you think, well, we've got millions of dollars in the bucket that we're spending. Those road projects are done from grant funding and from restricted resources, restricted income that we receive that we cannot use for our police services. The only funding that we have flexibility in is our general fund, and that general fund covers basic city operations. There are no excess funds to even allocate towards adding police officers. So the only avenue at this point, unless somebody in the city wins the Mega Millions and decides to donate it to the city coffers, our only option at this point is to get interest from our community to do a tax levy lift, where you can be guaranteed 100% of that 7 cents that you pay for property tax goes for police services and nothing else. So that's my political rant. But thank you again for being here. It's nice to see that there is interest and there is concern in the community.
Yeah, any final questions? Do you have a question? Yeah.
Have you seen a difference or a correlation with the amount of calls to police since these laws have been passed versus prior before? I don't know if this is the same question that was asked earlier, but based on just chatter on social media and people making up their own things because there's a lot of confusion, have you seen a difference in the amount of calls that come versus prior to this media blitz regarding these new laws?
Yeah. So the stat earlier about showing that our calls for service are down roughly 15 to 20% this year. I don't know to be very concrete of an answer for you. I kind of felt like that would be an element of it, as people are like, well, they're not going to come anyways. So I've been watching the news and here they're saying they're not going anything. I'm not even going to bother calling. We battled that all the time in a way. Some people don't call because their car got broken into and nothing got stolen. And then 2 neighbors do that, and then the third one calls and says, my neighbors did it. And I'm like, well, we didn't get a call, so we don't know what's going on. So again, we're just encourage people to call still. It's us to decipher what to do with that information and how we respond. I don't know, it might be a good survey kind of question, right? Has the passage of these laws influenced you and when you might call the police? That would be an interesting one to ask the community to see, and then maybe why, if it has or it hasn't, how has it influenced you? That's a good question. I'll say one really quick too, because as the mayor said, we have conversations around staffing and in the department, and so before COVID, January of 2020, the council had a retreat, and I did a presentation about. Really, it was a half day that they committed to public safety, and they really wanted to dive in and learn about public safety in UP, the department, and all those elements. And I presented a plan for increased staffing in terms of what we needed kind of on the immediate. And then COVID hit us, and we had a kind of a plan to kind of get out there and get to talking with people, and then COVID slowed everything down. But in a way, one of the positives that came out of that is through that time, we kind of sat back and looked at that plan, myself and with Jennifer and the other staff at the department. What is it that we really need? And originally I was like, we just need patrol officers. We need 6 more patrol officers, and I need a supervisor. We stepped back and looked at it and said, yeah, that'd be great. Because for me, the fundamental thing of police is responding to 911 calls. If we don't have enough to do that and to respond not only effectively and efficiently but timely, we need to address that. But in University Place, my number one complaint is traffic. Honestly, it's traffic. I mean, yes, we have car prowls from time to time, and we have some different things that happen, but the consistent thing is traffic complaints. And we do not have dedicated traffic officers. I only have 2 officers that are out on the street at a time working, and they're responsible for those 911 calls and conducting any type of small investigations that they can in between those calls. So that's where we looked back at that and was, well, maybe we need to really consider adding traffic officers to try and have a direct impact on traffic safety in UP. Yeah, we can do like special emphasis for a couple of weeks on overtime, and we can look at this neighborhood for a little bit, but honestly, that's like putting a Band-Aid on a gushing wound. It might slow it down for those couple of weeks, but it doesn't create, I would say, a sustained sense of traffic safety within the community. I always get this, well, in Furcrest, everybody knows to slow down through Furcrest. You're going to get stopped there. And I mean, I can remember that back when I was in high school. It was like, ooh, slow down when you're going through there. They have 1 or 2 officers for a city of 5,000. And we've got right around 34,000 citizens in University Place with 2 officers that are trying to do what they can. So I'm telling you that to say that it's not just, hey, we want money for more officers. We're really trying to be making it as impactful as we can. So there's we're looking at 2 traffic officers, 2 back on the patrol but on swing shift, which is our busiest shift. It has the most amount of calls and that kind of higher level of calls. And then we're looking for a non-commissioned position. So this is what we're calling right now is just a community outreach officer that is out there as those 911 calls may become about panhandling. We really, as we kind of talked about here, is we don't want to send a police officer to that, may not even rise to that. But can we send some level of service out to contact that person and really engage with them, see what issues they have? Maybe we can offer resources, but it's not coming from law enforcement. So that's the plan is getting that and then getting an additional investigator. Because I talked about the impacts of some of this and how we need more investigative resources. and then an additional supervisor. We run right now with one supervisor who's supervising 14 people. That span of control is way too much. He does a fantastic job, but especially if we're going to add more bodies to that, I do need a supervisor. And that supervisor would be a detective sergeant supervisor. So adding that element of increased expertise in investigating crime. So instead of right now our crimes, if we have a non-property crime, so a person crime, it's going downtown to the sheriff's department. It's getting put into the pile with all their other ones from across the county, and they're using their resources the best they can to address those. And sometimes that means the UP one doesn't get followed up on. So that's my intention, is if we get that level here, we can keep that case here, we can work it within our own jurisdiction, and see some resolution to it. I think it's worth the money to do that. It provides the best service. We've seen so much success by having investigators embedded into the jurisdiction, the precinct in which they work, because they're working directly with those patrol officers on trying to solve crimes. So that's my goal, and I share that with you as it's not just a, hey, let's just get more money and then we're just going to throw some more patrol officers out. We really been thoughtful about what we want to do if something comes our way, to be able to do that. And try and make an impact where I think that people will notice moving forward. So that's my pitch anyway. So any final questions or anything here? Anything from Jennifer online? No, email. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I just have a really quick question.
Uh-huh.
You said that the traffic is the biggest complaint that you get, but what is our accident rate or incident?
I don't have accident rate or specifics. We have a fairly, I mean, I don't know. That's a good question in terms of trying to compare us to others. We have probably on average 3 or 4 accidents a week. For the speeds of our roads, that's a little bit high. Most of our roads, I mean, we only go up to 35 miles an hour. So, well, yeah, you're supposed to. And the challenges that we have is, some of our side streets turn into, hey, I'm going to bypass Bridgeport, so I'm going to go through, I'm going to take Sunset and I'm going to treat it as Bridgeport, or somewhere off of Grandview, that type of thing. So I think our accident rate, and it fluctuates, of course, but also with the traffic comes somebody dedicated for DUIs. We don't have anybody that's dedicated to watch for impaired drivers and processing those. The ability to sit in a neighborhood and run the radar and try and make an impact in there. So, but that's a good question about the accident rate, and I'll have to look into that and see how we compare. I think it's a little bit high for our community, but yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
I know that when, over the years, we added the calming and the years, in years past, in order to, there were statistics where at this corner we had so many accidents. Mm-hmm. And now that we've done this, that, and the other thing, there's fewer accidents there. So that's the kind of thing that I was looking at, is where in our town is the biggest problem. Mm-hmm. Not the most complaints, but what is actually happening out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a challenge that we run into in terms of perceptions and then reality, right? Is some people, and we do have the ability to put out counters on the road, right? And so somebody will say, hey, the speeding is crazy on this road. We'll put the counter out there, and the counter kind of gives us, it's not that bad, right? I mean, yeah, you're going to have a few here and there, maybe during the commute time, but it's not always. I think people, when they see it one time, and then 2 days later they see it again, and then it automatically goes, oh, this road is terrible. It's a racetrack all the time. Just when you're there, maybe you need to stay away. I don't know, but no, it's that is a challenge, right? Is trying to determine what is the reality of the problem. But I think going back to that whole perception of safety as well. And again, it's up to the community to decide what level of service they want. Sometimes just having the officer there running radar, it slows people down. They feel safer. They feel that the roads are safer. Maybe the officer doesn't even get a single traffic stop in a matter of an hour or 2 hours because everybody was going the speed limit. I think my goal is by doing that, is we're going to kind of perpetuate this culture of just slowing down a little bit on all the streets within UP. Because whether or not speed is the factor of the accidents is probably a whole nother question too. What are the causes of our accidents? Is it just inattentive driving? I don't review all the traffic accident reports. That's the sergeant handles most of that, but I would lean towards that's probably a bigger challenge for us versus speed causing the accidents. Other than our major collisions, we've had a few of those here late at night. Some fatality collisions that have all been speed related. So that's a good question. Okay, that it? I know I've said that like 4 times. I'm not trying to push you out the door, but I will say that I really appreciate everybody being here. I know when we talked about doing this, I really wanted it to be in person. Thanks for those that are watching online. But I just think that there's so much more value with the in-person and being able to hear other people's questions and be able to feed off of that. So, and my last thing is, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, you have any comments or suggestions. You also have a public safety advisory committee, which we have a couple members of that here. So these are citizens that have volunteered to be a part of this commission. Actually, we have 3 here tonight. So you have representatives as well that they get together monthly to discuss public safety things here. And so you have a citizen representative on that group, and they kind of have a work plan typically and talk about different things that impact it, and they report directly to the council as well. So you have that option. With that, Jennifer is saying, yes, I can go now. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.